In this video, I'll give you a quick overview of the PPP tab that appears when you install the Pivot Power Premium add-in. If you'd like to follow along in the same workbook that I'm using, you can download that from the main help page for the PPP add-in. There are 8 groups of commands, starting with preferences at the left and going across to resources at the right. So we'll start here in preferences, and you can use these commands to store up to 5 groups of settings for your pivot tables. It's best if you put all your favorite settings into the first set, and you can apply those quickly here, either to a selected pivot table or to all the pivot tables in a workbook. We'll just take a quick look at that form. Here's where you can choose a setting, and you can change those at any time after you create them. So there's setting number 3 and all of its formatting and layout options. Or you can go back and choose a different one, and then down at the bottom there are buttons to save and apply it, or save and close, or cancel. In this workbook I have some sales data, and I also have 3 pivot tables set up, so you'll be able to use those for testing. And if we look at this one, we can click Apply Pref 01, and it changes the settings, the formatting, whatever options we had stored there. So that's much quicker than going to the settings and the formatting and changing all those things individually. In the next group, we have number formatting. There are built-in lists of number formats, a whole long list, and you can apply them either to all of the value fields in the pivot table, or just select a few value fields and only change those. You can also set up a custom format and then apply it. In the next group, data fields, there are settings to change either all the value fields or selected value fields to use a certain function. When you create a pivot table, the fields automatically go in as sum or count. You can choose one of the others, and there's also a sum all button, which lets you quickly fix a new pivot table if fields have been automatically entered as count and you want to get them all changed to sum. And this command, show selected as, lets you change the calculation that's used on the selected value fields. The next group is pivot fields and items. That lets us change the appearance and the settings for pivot fields and pivot items and change some of the data settings. So let's look at this other pivot table. So here we have sum of. That's one of the things that I usually change in a new pivot table. I can get rid of all those sum of and count of with this setting. If you've added a few fields to the row areas, you can quickly add all the remaining fields to the values areas. And pivot items are things like repeating item labels or showing items that don't have data. Like here we have cheese that was only sold in the West. So I'll select that field, region, and show items with no data, and then it shows that field, so we have consistency in the pivot table layout. And this button changes a data retention setting so that if you take items out of your source data, they don't keep appearing in the drop-down headings in the pivot table. The next group is pivot table, and that lets you see information about your pivot tables or change some of the pivot table settings. Things like turning the Get Pivot Data feature on or off, or your auto fit. Sometimes you'll set up a pivot table at certain widths and you don't want it to adjust automatically. You can also get lists of the pivot tables in a workbook or information about a selected pivot table. And here is a pivot table builder, which lets you create lists of fields from a pivot table or a worksheet table, and then create a new pivot table based on those fields. For totals, you can hide or show grand totals or subtotals. The next group is filters and cache, and that lets you clear filters in a pivot table, or you can clear report filters or sort them, or allow or turn off multiple filters. The cache, some of these will only work with normal pivot tables, not data model pivot tables. You can get a cache list or a count, and for some pivot tables you can change the cache they're using or even create a new cache. The next group of commands is for the workbook, and that lets you change the way the worksheet looks, such as hiding the grid lines or the zeros, turn those on and off. And you can also control the scroll bars. The final group is resources, and that's where you can get a link to the help page on my website, or click here and you'll see which version you're using and links to email me or go to the website.